Hi, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I've seen the list of attendees, and there's some very good lawyers from all across the province, from Windsor to Ottawa with us today. And I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and spend some of your lunch hour having a conversation with us about long-haul COVID. This is part of a series of seminars that Gluckstein has put on talking about issues, especially with the focus in the Ottawa office. And we want to especially thank the folks from Ottawa that have joined us today. I also want to thank, before I get into this, Shelley Dingra, who did a great job putting together the PowerPoint presentation that you can see on the screen, and Brenda Agnew that worked with Shelley in terms of putting this all together. So thank you for Shelley and Brenda for all the work that you've done. So I wanted to have a brief conversation today, talk about long-haul COVID claims or post-COVID claims and where we are with respect to that. This is a sheet from a page from our website, and I think it's similar to a lot of other websites that I've seen in the province. I did a quick check when I was putting this together. A quick search shows that there are at least 24 law firms in Ontario alone that have post-COVID LTD landing pages on them. And most of those pages talk about this issue about needing to seek legal advice because insurance companies in a lot of these cases are refusing to conduct a meaningful examination of the claims. And a year and a half ago, we thought this was going to be a battleground. And I really think, although the fight hasn't developed as intensely as I thought that it was going to, the fight is still coming. And the theme that I see when I look at other lawyers' websites and our website, and I look at what we're dealing with, is that these cases are not being properly examined. What we're going to talk about today is the fact that post-COVID claims are difficult to prove for a lot of reasons, and they're being viewed with suspicion and skepticism. I think that we're finding it hard to get data with respect to these cases, and we'll talk about that a little bit more lately. What I'm seeing, and this is a broader trend in the long-term disability world, is that insurers are coming to the table early, looking to mediate all cases, including these post-COVID cases. And a lot of these cases, I think because of the demographic of the people that are coming forward, are settling at a very early stage. And you know, one could make the argument that the early settlements that are proceeding in the long-term disability field are perhaps being overused, especially in the post-COVID cases. So let's talk about why I'm interested in long-haul COVID. I think what we're looking at here and what we're realizing here is the fact that in Ontario, there's really only been a small set of lawyers that are focused on long-term disability cases. I think that there's a lot of lawyers that do some LTD work, but that are mostly slip and fall lawyers or accident benefit motor vehicle lawyers, and that are doing that kind of work and that are now moving to doing some sort of LTD. But there are some of us that have been doing long-term disability work for 25 years or more. And this is the latest area of battle that I think we're seeing coming forward. One of the problems I think we're seeing with long-haul COVID is that the literature, for the most part, that I'm looking at focuses on the medicine and the science, and there isn't a lot of data or information coming out right now on the process of litigating long-haul COVID issues, right? In terms of my background and why I'm interested, and I'm not going to spend very much time going over this, is I am the former chair and vice chair of the LTD section. I've litigated hundreds of cases, and basically what happened in 2020 is that OTLA, amongst its lawyers, saw a rise in this concept of post-COVID-19 cases as a disability vector. We had a round table on this, some of you will recall, more than a year ago, and we've been looking at it as a section. We've been talking to mediators about it, and as I said before, we've all put up web pages to deal with this as a problem. What we're seeing everywhere is that everybody is identifying this discussion about long haul COVID is getting a lot of media attention out there. And this is another reason I think that we're interested in it. There have been articles in the Globe and Mail, the Star, the Financial Post, on CBC, on CTV. In fact, even today, there was an article on long haul COVID in the Law Times. So this is a topic that is in the news, and it's in the news continuously. And people are talking about it. What we're not seeing is a development for the reasons that we're going to talk about. We're not seeing a development to give us the tools that we need to deal with these cases. And part of that is because, like a lot of invisible cases that we used to deal with before, like fibromyalgia and like chronic pain syndrome and like depression, post-COVID is something that is difficult to understand. And it's something that manifests itself very differently from case to case. And one of the things that we want to take a look at is the fact that COVID, in terms of the impact on our society, needs to be viewed from an historical perspective. And I say that COVID is fundamentally different, even though I've said it's similar. It's fundamentally different from discussions about things like fibromyalgia and chronic pain syndrome, because it's part of a larger catastrophic health event that has impacted our society. And I think one of the things that we need to deal with when we talk about insurers is I think we need to focus on the fact that from an historical perspective, what has happened with respect to COVID is different from any other disease that we've looked at. But what has happened is not actually unique. It's happened before to humanity, and it will happen again. Bill Gates has been warning about something like COVID for decades. I remember in 2008, I went down to a Rotary conference when I was president of my Rotary Club, and Bill Gates was the keynote speaker in Los Angeles. And he was talking about a disease is going to come that we have no immunity for, and it's going to have a catastrophic health impact on our society. And you know, if we look at it, and let's just sort of talk about this, there's lots of historical examples of this. Again, people are viewing this as, you know, something we've never seen before, and we haven't perhaps seen that in our generation, but we have seen this as a species. And I've just put a couple examples up. There's a lot more out there, but if you look at the Black Death that impacted in the Middle Ages, that arguably killed as many as 1/3 of the population of Europe, there are strains and diseases and problems and genetic markers and impacts from Black Death that still impact the global population today. The Black Death could have been a species eradicating event, and we didn't have the health science to deal with it back then, but our species as a change, or as a whole, reacted to the Black Death and everything that was associated with it. More recently, when Western European colonization of North America occurred, and again, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but Europeans brought diseases that had devastating impacts on the indigenous population. And not only were indigenous folks getting disease that they've never seen before, in many, many cases, unfortunately, these diseases were fatal. More recently, in 1918, we saw the Spanish flu, which is actually probably the most similar to the outbreak we've seen in COVID. It is a fact that the Spanish flu killed more people in World War II than were actually killed in World War II. And the other thing that scientists will tell you, geneticists will tell you, is that many of the flu strains that are going around in the world today are flu strains that were around that have their roots in the Spanish flu from 2000 or from 1918. So this concept of a catastrophic health event that impacts the entire world or impacts entire cultural groups is something that is a cyclical problem that comes along, not every day or every week or even every generation, but it does come along. And to some ways, COVID could have been worse. And I say that because if COVID had been more deadly, like the Spanish flu, or if COVID had terrible long-term health implications, like for instance HIV, that took years to develop. As bad as the world has been impacted by COVID, it would have been even worse. So I think this is a wake-up call for us, because if you talk to Mr. Gates and if you talk to others, if you watch their presentations on YouTube, they don't think we're done dealing with disease issues like this, and they think in some ways we've been lucky with COVID because COVID could have been worse. So let's talk about that for a second. What has been the impact from a local perspective in terms of COVID-19? The recent estimates, and this is a moving target and it's difficult to keep up with, but the Globe and Mail published an article this week based on CDC and Health Canada statistics, and they estimate that somewhere between 60 and 70% of Canadians have already been infected with COVID-19. The data shows that more and more people are having double and triple infections, and in fact, that's becoming prevalent. The vaccines that are out there are not doing as good a job as we would hope in terms of protecting people. I don't know if anyone saw this news article this week, but the head of the CDC got his dose, his new bivalent dose, a month ago, and it didn't prevent him from getting COVID for a second time. One of the things that we're no longer talking about, and we should, is at its worst, COVID was considered to be the third highest cause in death of Canada in terms of over time. And the other problem that we have going forward is a disproportionate number of uninfected are seniors, and they're in nursing homes. And there's a massive impact on the quality of life that they have. I can tell you that my parents are in a nursing home, and they've been locked down 3 or 4 times in the last 6 months. They're locked down right now. My wife's mother is in a nursing home. She's under lockdown again for the 3rd or 4th time. And then the big thing that brings us here today in terms of the impact of COVID is the rise of something called the post-COVID condition, or long COVID. So let's talk about COVID versus post-COVID. And this is something that I think is out there, but I think it's important that you convey when you're forwarding your clients' cases as they deal with post-COVID symptoms. Post-COVID is not COVID. There's a lot of material on this. If you've got any questions about it or something, look at the CDC information, look at the Health Canada information, look at the Mayo Clinic, look at what's out there. So the COVID symptoms and are listed on the screen in front of you, but sore throat, headaches, aches, pains, diarrhea, rashes, irritation, shortness of breath, loss of speech, chest pain, fever, cough, tiredness, loss of taste of smell. These are symptoms that are more similar than we would see in a flu or a respiratory illness or something like that. I hasten to say that there's actually dozens or hundreds of COVID symptoms, but these are the most common symptoms that come up almost across the board. And so post-COVID symptoms are a different animal. And so a couple things that are out there in terms of post-COVID. There are more than 100 separate symptoms and complaints that medical practitioners, doctors, researchers are identifying with post-COVID syndrome. It impacts different people in different ways. The other thing that is very interesting out there is that it impacts adults and children very differently. Now, that doesn't necessarily impact us when we do LTD work, but I think it's something that is worth considering as we move forward and we try and learn more about post-COVID. Now, from an LTD perspective, and this is one thing I'm having to emphasize quite a bit, is I need to make the distinction to insurance companies when I deal with cases that there is a difference between COVID and post-COVID. And it's important, I think, for me, and I'm running into this problem is I have lots of clients that have never even been diagnosed as having COVID or not properly diagnosed. I have clients who are relatively young people who had what they thought was the post-COVID symptoms at a later basis. And I'm having insurance people say, well, these people were not hospitalized. These people didn't have a terrible time with COVID. How can they be complaining about this now? And one of the things, and again, this is contentious, but one of the things that's clear from the literature is that there is not necessarily a correlation between the severity of your COVID outbreak and the severity of your post-COVID problems. The two medical conditions are related, but they're distinctly different from each other. And it does not matter if your client was hospitalized. It does not matter if your client was elderly, or if your client is a compromised individual, or if your original symptoms were necessarily serious. If your client had COVID or even suspected that she had COVID, that opens the door to argue that your client is dealing with a post-COVID cluster of symptoms, whether or not your client necessarily had a difficult time with COVID in the first place. So let's talk about what's involved in post-COVID in adults. And again, this is information that I pulled from the actual CDC in this case. These are the most common symptoms that are complained of by individuals that are experiencing post-COVID. Again, there's up to 100 symptoms. The one thing that I want to say about this is this list is profoundly different, in my opinion, than the list of COVID problems. There's some overlap, obviously, like sleep disturbance and like shortness of breath. But the number one leading problem that I'm encountering from people that are coming to me and complaining about post-COVID is fatigue. And the number two that isn't very far behind are memory problems. Yeah, there's some shortness of breath. I'm also seeing a lot of discussion on or complaints about anxiety and impression. And I have one case in my office where the person is complaining or has been told that they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Quite frankly, I'm struggling with that because my understanding of PTSD is usually that there was a trauma that induced it, but I can tell you that it's on the CDC list, and I do have at least one person that's come into my office and talked about it, as a problem. But the other thing that I would point out when we look at this, and especially I'm talking to the lawyers in the audience that have done a lot of this type of work before. If you look at that list of symptoms, I guess what I'm going to say is, my feeling is we've been to this rodeo before. When you look at this list of symptoms, and for folks that have been practicing for a while, 10 or 15 years or so in LTD, one of the biggest areas of litigation and contention related to fibromyalgia. And there was a huge debate, and in my view, a similar debate, about fibromyalgia being an invisible disease, difficult to diagnose, difficult to understand. There was a huge fight back in the day, and some of you will recall this, that there's an allegation that some insurance companies made and some insurance company doctors made that fibromyalgia if an insurance adjuster can't wrap their head around what our client has, it's going to be difficult to get the insurance adjuster to take the disability issue seriously. I am going to lump this post-COVID in with fibromyalgia, but I'm also going to lump it in with the other, I'm going to call it the invisible illness category. I would say that includes myofascial pain. It includes chronic pain. I had cases back in the day, a couple of cases where I had clients with lupus, and I had one case where I had a client with Lyme disease. And in all of these cases, we were dealing with a cluster of problems that reminds me, as somebody that's been doing this for a long time, with the kind of common complaints we're getting right now with post-COVID. And the way that we dealt with those complaints, I think, needs to be the roadmap for dealing with these cases going forward. The challenge is that in these other cases, sometimes there were diagnostically accepted tests. So people know a rheumatologist could diagnose fibromyalgia with 14 out of 18 trigger points. What we don't have to assist us in our toolbox today is a way of diagnosing people with post-COVID, some clear objective problem. And it is going to be a problem. And the reason that it's going to be a problem is because of the potential prevalence of post-COVID in adults, right? In other words, what is the scope of the problem? And this is an area where the statistical data, and it's subjective, but the statistical data is pretty clear, right? There's a great debate on how disabled people are from post-COVID, but there's widespread agreement that the problem is significant, right? The World Health Organization, as early as 2020, was publishing data that was estimating that 10 to 20% of people were dealing with one or more symptoms 12 weeks or longer after the initial diagnosis. 10 to 20% of people. Now, and this is interesting because I think it contradicts some of the data that I was showing you before. That includes people with new symptoms, and that includes people with symptoms that have persisted since the initial infection. But let's go back to the number we talked about in Canada. If conservatively 60% of people have gotten COVID, and so we're dealing with 20 million people, give or take, and 10% of them have post-COVID that continues for some period of time. Conservatively, we're dealing with millions of people in the best case scenario that had lingering symptoms. Now, do these symptoms continue indefinitely? The World Health Organization doesn't say that. But there is a recent Health Canada publication, and you can see this if you look on their website and look at it. The recent health data, and this is from 2022, they show that 30 to 40% of people that even were not hospitalized for their symptoms still report symptoms beyond 12 weeks. And now they suggest that there is a correlation of people that were hospitalized having post-COVID symptoms. I think that is a matter of debate. I think that's a matter that we can look at. But whether the number is 10%, 20%, 30%, or 40%, it's pretty clear in terms of the scope of the problem. There are potentially millions of people that are dealing with lingering effects from COVID months after the original diagnosis. The other thing that's out there in the literature is the fact that it's pretty clear that there's a much higher than expected incidence of post-COVID syndrome in previous healthy young adult population. So compare this to the flu. You might have lingering problems from the flu if something happens, but for the most part, young, healthy people, and I'm going to give an abbreviation, I'm going to call them millennials. Millennials catching the flu mostly are going to recover and not have lingering healthcare problems. There is a statistically relevant percentage of young, healthy, fit people that are catching COVID that aren't necessarily hospitalized from it and that are dealing with ongoing problems. And from an insurance perspective and from a litigation perspective, to some degree, that's everyone's worst nightmare. I have lots and lots of LTD clients of people that are in their late 40s or 50s or even 60s. And we can talk about whether it's the reality is, that I, for one, always find difficult to settle. And I would suggest to folks that are litigating those cases out there, we ought to be very, very careful about going to a pre-discovery mediation. Healthy and is now complaining about post-COVID, because we really might be messing up that young person for the balance of his or her life, given the relative age factor, especially when we're dealing with the disease that we don't understand that well. So let's talk about, and in terms of understanding the disease well or not, one of the things I wanted to point out, just to put on people's radar, this is not necessarily relevant to LTD litigation, but it is relevant to post-COVID. And I was surprised when I saw this in terms of doing my research and preparing for this. Post-COVID looks different when you're dealing with children. Post-COVID with children is very poorly understood. Partly that's because of communication issues. But there are children that are developing post-COVID syndrome, and they're complaining about some things that are similar, like sleep problems, okay, and like fatigue. But they're also complaining about different issues that we're not commonly seeing in the adult population, right? Including delirium, and cognitive problems, headaches, abdominal pain, and joint pain. And these symptoms, although they're present in many adults, seem to be clustered to a much higher percentage with children. And this suggests to us that there's still a lot about COVID and the way COVID affects your brain and your immune system and everything as a whole that we don't understand. Nobody has any idea why children would have a different cluster of post-COVID syndromes than adults. But what it does suggest to me from a worry standpoint is we really don't understand this disease. We really don't understand how it's impacting people. There's all kinds of theories about why post-COVID is causing problem. Isn't an organic problem with the brain, which is one argument that's out there. It actually infects the brain and causes changes at the neurochemical level at the brain. Is it impacting or infecting the lymphatic system or the immune system, or is it just psychological? The jury's out on all these issues, and it's something that we should be careful of as disability lawyers in looking at it, because I, for one, am right now very worried about settling my clients' cases when they say they can't work, and I don't think anybody really understands the disease. I don't think there's enough work being done in terms of research into post-COVID syndrome. I don't think that there's a proper way to treat it and a proper way to deal with it. So let's turn to how it is actually impacting disability claims. As we talked about, in terms of practical questions, concern was arising as early as 2020. There were the articles we talked about in television and print media, and there was an increase. Our phones fell silent because people weren't calling us with respect to car accident cases because everybody was working virtually. The one area that our phones did start ringing, and Mr. Romaine, who might be on this call, will know this, is wrongful dismissal cases and post-COVID disability claims. I think there was an initial tendency to dismiss long COVID by employers and by insurers. I think the focus was on COVID-19 itself, especially when there were the fatalities in the nursing homes and rest homes. And I think that we weren't really looking at this issue in terms of how it was impacting our population at the time, right? And we were focusing on the disease, not the aftermath, on the aftermath. The other thing I think that was happening is because people were collecting CERB benefits, and I saw this, people that have come to me and said, I haven't been able to work for a year and a half or something like that. Well, what were you living on at this point? Well, I was at home. My employer laid me off temporarily and I was collecting the CERB. So you had people that weren't going into work all the time, even though they were having ongoing symptoms, even though they were having brain fog, even though they were having fatigue. And like people that had brain injuries, if they were avoiding the stresses of work, sometimes their problems were not evident. And we're now seeing this as a problem as people are going back into work because they're going back into work and they're struggling. So that's why, in my view, the problem is likely going to get worse as we go forward. And we look at it. It is being recognized, and I just wanted to throw this up for people that are having, I don't know if anyone's having this fight, but there are American publications, the CDC and others, that are making it clear that long COVID is recognized as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The government of Canada has published on its government websites, in terms of for federal employees, that changes and improvements are being made to support disability claims for long COVID, being made through disability insurance in the LTD process. I think there is still some resistance to long COVID as a disability for the reasons that we've talked about. And again, I think that's partly because we've decided that we're just going to ignore COVID as an issue, which I quite frankly think is surprising. I talked about the fact that there's COVID outbreaks everywhere in the nursing homes, and people are probably seeing that right now. The death rate from COVID now is as high as it's been in times when we've been under lockdown. But society appears ready to move on from COVID. Governments appear ready to move on to COVID. And it appears that we've just made the decision that we're going to work through COVID, and COVID is going to be a thing of the past. And I, for one, am worried that long COVID is going to end up falling in that category. The other problem we have in terms of resistance to it is the person that comes into your office and complains about post-COVID may not have been hospitalized. In a lot of cases, was not actually diagnosed. I have clients from late, in the middle of the process that said, I've got COVID, and the healthcare system, which is completely overwhelmed right now, said, we don't need to bother to test you. You're not, a high risk person. Stay at home and be, quiet. And there might be a lack of employer support. I think remote work has masked the problem. I have people that are not doing their jobs well, and it wasn't until they get called into work, maybe not full time, but 2 or 3 times a day, and they're back with their employer, and their employer is noticing the productivity when they see them face to face that they're not seeing when they were working remotely. And then the other thing I've said in terms of resistance to COVID, and we've talked about this already, is it's an invisible disease, like chronic pain, like fibromyalgia, like lupus, and like others. I think what we need to focus on are what are the key symptoms that might keep our clients out of the workplace. And those key symptoms, in my experience, and we had a longer list before, but the clients I have that are coming in and saying, I can't work, brain fog, fatigue, memory problems, anxiety, and depression. Of course, the problem with anxiety and depression isn't everybody having anxiety and depression? Isn't everybody tired of being locked up and not seeing loved ones and having lost people and all that other stuff? So if somebody comes in and says, I'm anxious and I'm depressed, how much sympathy are they getting right now from their employers and from people around them? What's happening in the disability world? And I'm curious to see what other people think of this, but I wanted to give my 2 cents. In our office, we're seeing a lot of calls and queries about this. We're not seeing as many claims as I thought that we were going to see a year ago. Why aren't we seeing as many claims? We've talked about the fact that there's remote work out there. My other particular theory is we're dealing with a massive labor shortage right now. There are all kinds of employers out there that cannot get enough warm bodies to keep things going. I was saying to some people before the call started that my local breakfast place where I live in Midland, Ontario, is closed on Mondays and Tuesdays now due to lack of labor. There are retail stores and other operations that are cutting back shifts or services due to labor shortages. And I think that there are people that are not functioning properly, that are having problems due to long COVID. And those problems are currently, to some degree, being ignored because of what's going on. And I'm curious to see if the recession that people think is coming in Q1 and Q2 next year comes, if we're going to see a surge of post-COVID cases at that time. What's happening in the disability world? We've talked about this before. When you're dealing with an insurance adjuster, it is not necessary to prove what's caused the disability. But as a practical consideration, in my respectful opinion, as a practical consideration, you want to try and prove that there's something wrong with your client. There's going to be skepticism, especially in the labor market. The problem with that is, even unlike fibromyalgia, and I've said before, there isn't a clearly recognized test. My daughter, who works in a genetics lab, tells me that if you never got vaccinated and you got COVID, you can likely do a test that will determine if you had COVID, but that test would be expensive. It would have to be done at a genetic level, and nobody's going to do it with respect to how the healthcare system is overwhelmed. This is what the CDC says about testing. There's no test to diagnose post-COVID conditions. People can have a wide variety of problems. It can be difficult for healthcare providers to recognize post-COVID conditions. And they basically go on and say, to diagnose somebody as post-COVID, you have to do a complete health history. You've got to look to see whether there was a positive test or symptoms or exposure, and you have to do a health examination, right? I read that, I think it's completely subjective. And so as a practical matter, although it would be helpful to prove that you have some reason that your client is ill, because we all get this problem, right? We get the report that says there is no objective evidence that this person has any problem. Well, there's no objective evidence because there's no objective test. I think it's even worse if your client's problem is psychological or mental, because that's going to require active treatment under the terms of the policy, maybe, because there are a lot of treatments that say if you have a certain psychological issue that you're going to have to get treatment, or they might simply deny it for the same thing, saying that there's no objective evidence that's going to support this. So where does that bring us in terms of COVID litigation? I'm not aware of any trial decision on post-COVID syndrome. Now, part of that is I can't get to trial. I don't know if anybody else is in the same situation. I'm currently being given pre-trial dates in Central East for the very end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024. I suspect if I've got a case today that's ready for trial, I'm not going to try it till 2025. So given those delays in the system, I think it's going to take a while for LTD cases to get up to the top of the queue. I think the other problem that we have to deal with, and we know this, is most cases, LTD cases, are settled. Very, very few cases go to trial. And this is sort of a warning that I wanted to throw out there. A lot of cases that I'm hearing anecdotally, and I've had a couple of people call me, I settled my LTD case at a mediation before discoveries. Now I regret my decision. Well, if you settled your client's case and she signed a release, your client's toast, especially if your client's younger. I think there's going to be a general belief that your client can return to work. I'm seeing, just so you know, and I think it's going to be very difficult. If your client's a millennial and your client's complaining of post-COVID syndrome, even if he or she qualifies for CPP disability, it's going to be very difficult to get. Are you going to get the doctor's evidence? I mean, the other thing that I haven't talked about, and we should, is a lot of people didn't see their doctors in person during COVID. They just had phone calls with them. And that is leading to a weakness, even in terms of the clinical notes and records and things like that, because there isn't the same history that you would see of somebody going in and complaining to the doctor. Causation is a background. Again, there's a dispute whether there's a test going on. And in my view, a lot of what's going on is people are still working. There are a lot of people that have post-COVID, and post-COVID can be like cancer and fibromyalgia and depression. There's lots of people with cancer and fibro and depression that are still working. There's lots of people with post-COVID that are still working, right? The question is, what's going to happen when there's a recession? Are these people going to be the first ones terminated? And we know a recession's coming. The Bank of Canada increased its rate again. So people that are technically, and this is going to be an interesting argument for us, probably aren't meaningfully working now, but they're around because the labor shortage is so much, and they're going to be forced to leave work in the future. There's also been a discussion in the literature, and I haven't seen this develop, but if you're walking wounded and you're working, and then something else happens, your reserves are going to be lower. So there are these future risk factors out there that I think is going to cause an upswing in cases, which brings us to the final point, which is the future of post-COVID litigation. I think the claims are going to rise. If 10% of COVID-19 cases result in long COVID, as I said before, there's millions of cases out there, and there's no recovery now. There's no data on how many of those people are recovered and how many of those people are what I'm calling walking wounded. I think part of the reason that the insurers are taking a hard edge on this is they see the possible extent of the problem. This could be an overwhelming financial burden for them. And they're going to throw up the roadblocks. I think that they're going to be worried about their own viability in the faces of these claims. I think that there are a lot of cases out there that are starting that we're settling at an early stage as a bar. And I think we ought to take a look at whether we should be settling those cases or not. I don't know what the solution is, because you know what? I've got clients tell me to settle too, and I don't think they should be settled. I think what's happening in these cases and what's going to happen is they're treating these like non-COVID cases, right? So depression is being treated like depression. PTSD is being treated like PTSD. And those cases are always big fights. But the recession is going to result, in my view, in a wave of claims, not just for long-term disability. I think it's going to result in wrongful dismissal claims. And I think it's going to result in human rights tribunal claims, because people are going to say, how come I went out the door first? I went out the door because I had COVID. So that is influencing work productivity in LTD claims. Physical or if your client's working as a telemarketer or something, I think it's going to be different. I'm going to give you my view on proving an LTD case. That I do in almost all cases where it's an issue is then I get a voc assessment. I get a copy of my client's job description. I get a voc person to do a report, and I say, given this person's job and this person's disability, can she do it? Yes or no? And I do that in almost all cases where they kick up a fight. I stick those two things back, and that's the basis of my claim. That's my secret for dealing with LTD claims. I think fundamentally, LTD claims are vocational cases. They're not you've got to establish just the vocational evidence that you can't do the job, and that's something I think as a profession, in my respectful view, we should do more of. I don't see, Brenda, any other questions.
No, I don't see any either, Steve. So certainly we can thank you very much. And we can encourage people to reach out to you if they have any additional questions that come up after this. We are going to make this webinar available for people to watch. After the fact, there is your contact information. So thank you. And yes, if anybody has any questions, please reach out to Steve and he can assist you.
I want to thank everybody for taking some time at the lunch to listen to me talk for a while. Everybody have a great day.